Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. The administration of Donald Trump has spawned a host of fascinating and in many cases novel legal issues. As the noose appears to tighten on former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, as well as former Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, there are serious legal questions as to how the scandal in Washington will play out. Among them are, what provable federal crimes will come out of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation? Is there sufficient evidence of collusion with the Russians in the 2016 election? Was it an obstruction of justice for Trump to fire FBI Director James Comey for refusing to call off his investigation of Mike Flynn? What high crimes and misdemeanors has Trump possibly committed? Is Trump likely to be impeached? And how will he defend himself? Can Trump fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller? Would this itself be an obstruction of justice? And then there is the subject of possible pardons. Can Trump pardon Mueller's cooperating witnesses? Or perhaps Manafort, Flynn, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, or Donald Trump Jr.? And if he does, what would this do to the rule of law? And the $64 question, can President Trump pardon himself? Here with possible answers is NYU law professor Ryan Goodman. Ryan Goodman has been writing and speaking extensively about all these issues and can share with us his insights into Trump's troubled legal position. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you.
You wrote in Newsweek just recently that Trump is expecting the worst from Mueller's investigation. What did you mean by that?
It seems as though, at least from what's been leaked into the news media, that Mueller seems to be closing in on Trump associates and maybe even the president himself. Seemingly that the part of the investigation that's highly active is obstruction of justice as an issue which implicates the president, and then some of the president's senior advisors, campaign manager Paul Manafort seems like he's in a lot of legal exposure or deep legal trouble. And if that's the case, that can really assist the special counsel in being able to flip certain people to then cooperate with the investigation, which could all be bad news for the president.
You said there's certain indications that have leaked out of the White House that Trump is taking this investigation very seriously. What are those indications?
So I think maybe the strongest indication that is not the most recent one is the earlier one in which it was leaked out that he was contemplating sweeping pardons for his members of his family and members of his campaign. You would only think that he would contemplate that kind of an action if he really thinks there's a threat. And in fact, the reports were that he in fact even contemplated a self-pardon. He asked the question, could he pardon himself? I think that's one, but there are other indications that haven't been as noticed. In a sense, it's just like one line in one news report, but the thing is the New York Times, in which there was also contemplation on the part of Trump's legal team to already start to develop a statement for Kushner having to resign. And they did that when they knew that the news media was going to report the Trump Tower June 9th, 2016 meeting with the Russians. So that must mean they knew something was very significant and incriminating in a sense, either legally in terms of criminal law or just politically. It was going to be a bombshell, but the idea that they would already prepare for Kushner to resign is yet a further indication.
How about his backing of Strange in the Alabama primary?
Right.
An establishment candidate, even though he probably liked the opponent better.
Right. It doesn't make sense why he would back Strange. His opponent was a much better fit for him, and Strange was so far behind in the polls, so close to the date of the election, that it was very difficult as a kind of a political calculation why he did that. So the news report in that was that Jared Kushner was the one to advise him to back Strange, and that the reason that Kushner did so is that Trump would be in better relations with the Senate in terms of Republicans in the Senate if the Russia investigation were to go south. So the idea that you would actually start to make maneuvers to back a particular candidate because you want to be in good with the Senate Republicans in case the Russia investigation goes south does seem to once again suggest anticipating that Mueller or the congressional investigations are going to produce something very significant.
Now, we hear so much these days of the word collusion. What does collusion mean to you as a lawyer?
It's a great question. I think that collusion to me as a lawyer means nothing, since that you can find collusion as a legal term in the federal statutes and the like. But what you would find is the closest legal connection is coordination. So that if the Trump campaign coordinated with foreign nationals and Russians in the release of, let's say, WikiLeaks documents or the DNC emails, or in coordination over Facebook advertising, that kind of contribution is a federal crime under federal campaign finance law. So that similar, one could use the word collusion. I think it doesn't make anything less clear by using the term collusion. In some ways it is a better term to understand what we're talking about. But if you want to find what is the actual legal hook, where would they be exposed under criminal law, that's the first place I would look.
Okay, so suppose an American citizen hacked John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, hacked his email or hacked the emails of the Democratic National Committee. Now that would be like a cyber Watergate burglary, and that must be some kind of a crime, wouldn't it?
That's a crime.
Okay. Now then he gives, this hypothetical American citizen gives the hacked documents to WikiLeaks, to Mr. Assange, that great patriot. And Assange dumps them all on the internet. Now, the Trump campaign then uses that information in connection with the election. Criminal or not criminal on their part?
Not necessarily criminal.
Not necessarily criminal. So
Yeah.
the person who hacked would commit a crime. There's a question as to whether Assange commits a crime as to publish hacked information. Certainly there's nothing wrong on its face with the Trump campaign using the fruits of it. Now suppose my hypothetical American isn't responsible for the hack, but it's Russia, Russian nationals and Russian operatives. Does that change the picture at all?
I think it changes the picture in a couple of ways. So to whatever degree the Russians are involved in the hacking, that's a federal crime. It's just a crime, let alone just to go into a computer system and steal information. That alone would be a federal crime. And then the question would be raised if there's any aiding or abetting, even after the fact, or an attempt to cover up the crime on the part of other Americans. One way in which I think this actually might play out is Mueller's options, especially if there are pardons that are given by the president. So one scenario might be that the president tries to pardon all the people associated with his campaign to just do away with the investigation. What purpose is there for Mueller after that point? He might as well, pack up his bags and go home. The answer is actually Mueller is after something bigger than just that. He's after the entire Russia investigation, which might mean that he would indict Russians. And then he could still name Trump campaign associates as unindicted co-conspirators who have been pardoned, so they can't be prosecuted. But that, I think, for the American public would be almost as bad. It would still mean that the special counsel has found that there's enough evidence to suggest that the Trump campaign associates are co-conspirators. So I think that's why it's really important to kind of keep our eye on the ball, and the ball is anybody who's involved in criminal activity around campaign interference.
Well, let's look for a minute at the pardon power, because the president under the Constitution only has the power, it would appear, to pardon individuals for federal crimes. Now, wouldn't that mean that Eric Schneiderman and State Attorney General could go after some of these people who were pardoned for possibly violating state law?
That's exactly right. So the president can only pardon for federal crimes. That then leaves open all of the states in which there are activity might have taken place. In New York, for sure. Activity related to the campaign, but also activity that might relate to financial crimes that have come up in Mueller's investigation. And there are reports that Mueller is coordinating with Schneiderman, and that he might also be coordinating with other attorney generals in other locations in which there are Trump businesses. So that would go on. And an interesting element of it is what the pardon would do that would actually enable state prosecutions. So if there is a pardon of those individuals, potentially they might not be able to claim Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, so they might have to make statements. There's also an argument that says the acceptance of a pardon is an acknowledgement of guilt. So if I were a state attorney general, I might think to myself, a pardon is actually kind of a booster rocket, because I can enter the trial saying that these folks have accepted or acknowledged some level of guilt in their activities. And I think that's another element in which the pardon might actually enliven state prosecutions.
Now, just to visualize a perversion of the pardon power, suppose, well, first place, pardon is normally granted after serving part of a sentence or all of the sentence. There's a pardon attorney in the Department of Justice and who comes up with a recommendation which eventually reaches the desk of the Attorney General, and all sorts of people are consulted. That's a filtered pardon, and that's characteristically the way it's been done. There's also an unfiltered pardon, like Sheriff Arpaio in Arizona, where no pardon attorney, no completion of sentence, no sentence at all. He was just cited for contempt, and then Trump summarily pardons him, full stop. Now, one could conceive of a situation, I suppose, where the president receives a bribe for issuing a pardon. In that case, would the bribe undermine the pardon so it has no force and effect? Or what would happen in that instance? Or would that be a high crime and misdemeanor and the president could be impeached?
So it's definitely the case that pardons could lead to impeachment. That was even contemplated at the Constitutional Convention when they were thinking about what the impeachment clause was all about. So certain kinds of pardons would be taken as just an abuse of power, and you don't even have to pin it on a particular federal crime, is that obstruction or not. But if the president were to pardon individuals in order to stop the investigation getting at wrongdoing, and also if he was trying to do it in a self-protective mode to protect himself, then I think that that could really enliven the Congress. And Republican senators have said as much, that would be the Saturday Night Massacre equivalent for our times. Secondly, there are law professors, legal experts, constitutional experts who think that a pardon, even if it is unfettered power on the part of the president, could still violate federal statute and constitute an obstruction of justice. So Eric Posner at University of Chicago Law School has made that argument in a New York Times op-ed, so that the pardon itself could be a federal offense. And that would be important for Donald Trump in the sense that there's a body of opinion that says a president can't be indicted or prosecuted while in office, but even that body of opinion says, yes, he can as soon as he leaves. So you might just think...
Well, there's no question about that in the Constitution. After he leaves, he could be indicted for the same crime that he might have been impeached for. I mean, there's no double jeopardy in that sense.
Exactly.
But if he abused the pardon power, that would appear to be a ground for impeachment, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Now, the $64 question, which Trump rhetorically asked in front of reporters, could he pardon himself? What's the answer to that?
Most constitutional lawyers say no.
Say no.
Yeah.
I mean, can the Pope canonize himself? Or does he leave that to subsequent popes?
Right, right, subsequent presidents. It is an interesting question in the sense that I've also even contemplated the idea that he would be better off in certain scenarios resigning so that he would have greater assurance that his successor could pardon him.
Now, what about this very shadowy figure who has gravitated around Trump since the early 1980s, Roger Stone, a Nixon trickster, and someone who has acknowledged that he had contact with Guccifer, the Russian platform that appears to have hacked the emails in question, and with Assange. And now, suppose he's implicated. Doesn't that another link in the chain that might establish what journalists call collusion and what we might call conspiracy?
I think absolutely true. That he at one point was hired as a consultant for Trump, he says, until August 2015. But even after that, he is a regular consultant and advisor to Donald Trump. He's basically de facto, if not in the letter of his contract, part of that campaign. And
urged him to run for president as early as 2004, I think.
That's right. Their relationship goes back far and deep.
And he was a partner of Paul Manafort. I think the story is storyline is he was introduced to Trump by Roy Cohn, in the late 1970s or in 1980, and shortly thereafter he went into partnership with Manafort.
That's right. And he also, according to the New York Times, advises Trump to hire Manafort, advises Trump to fire Comey. He's there all the way through, it seems like. And it seems as though at the very least, based on his own statements, and partly because he brags about it and likes to talk about it, he had knowledge, it looks like, of the release of the Podesta emails. So he knew that that was about to happen, and it seems as though if he's involved, for example, in the coordination or the timing of those releases, then I think they've got him. Then that is a form of a federal crime under federal campaign finance laws. And the other question would be, can they flip him? So that if they have enough evidence against him, could Mueller then say, come to our side, cooperate with us, tell us everything you know, and then that goes higher up the chain.
Let's move on to the firing of Comey and what Comey says the various conversations were that led up to his firing. Perhaps you could talk about that a little. Does that amount to, in your view, to an obstruction of justice? I mean, Trump had the power to fire him, didn't he?
He did. He had the power to fire him, but the basis that the basis on which he fired him could be very important. So if, take another example, if Trump were bribed to fire Comey, even though he has the power to fire him, we'd all take that as an abuse and that there was something wrong with it, even though you might think that he has the otherwise constitutional authority to determine whether or not the FBI director should still serve in his position. And so if he decided to fire Comey in order to subvert the Russia investigation, that's the key question. So that would be the question of, is that a corrupt motive? And as Comey said in testimony before the Senate, based on Trump's own statement and in the interview, for example, with Lester Holt on NBC, he did say then that he fired him because of the Russia investigation. So that starts to paint a pretty bleak picture for Trump in the sense that you're starting to get, I think, what I would say is a prima facie or an initial case of obstruction. So that's one element. I do think there's another element, and in speaking with former federal prosecutors, they point to this, which is not just the firing of Comey, but separately when Trump meets with Comey on Valentine's Day in the Oval Office and says to him, can't you go easy on Michael Flynn? Can't you drop this? That might be a greater likelihood of an obstruction of justice case, because firing the FBI director doesn't guarantee the end of the investigation. But actually getting an FBI director to drop an investigation, it's extraordinarily hard to ever pick that investigation back up.
Well, also with the intimation that he would reappoint Comey if he played ball, but he might fire him if Comey did not play ball. And Comey did not, and lo and behold, he was fired.
That's right. He asked him to pledge his loyalty, and he didn't.
Asked for loyalty.
Yeah.
Now, does it prove something to a lawyer that all these elaborate efforts were made to shut down the investigation of Flynn, who seems to be a linchpin in the whole matter, because he was talking with the Russians relaxing sanctions in exchange for possible help in the campaign?
That's right. Flynn seems to have great sympathy for the Russians, and at the very least seems to have committed, it looks like he likely committed a federal crime in lying to the FBI about his phone call with the Russian ambassador, and might have a whole bunch of information about what the campaign was or was not doing, was or was not aware of with respect to the Russian interference. So the idea that the President of the United States would swoop in, intervene, and try to get Flynn off the hook, I think would be very revealing. There were also reports in the Washington Post that Trump called up senior members of the intelligence community. Dan
Coates and Rogers.
Exactly.
And asked them to intervene with Comey, to have Comey call off the investigation. So it's more than just conversations with Comey that might be the subject of he said, she said.
That's right. And Rogers' staff memorialized the conversation after it took place. Huh?
So he's gone to considerable lengths to try to shut down the investigation, and it would have independent, what lawyers call independent probative force, wouldn't it? That he tried to cover it up or tried to stop it, much as flight is evidence of guilt.
Absolutely, I think that's a great point, and it also means that we can better understand why is Mueller looking into the kind of cover-up that the president himself was engaged in with respect to the New York Times reporting on the Trump Tower meeting. That's also probative of the sense that he's trying to cover up what's going on in the relationship between the Trump campaign and Russia, even though that cover-up with respect to the media is not on its own a federal crime.
Okay, let's go back to something you've referred to now a couple of times, which is the famous June 9th, 2016 meeting in Trump Tower, where all things seem to happen, the room where it happens.
Right, that's the room.
With Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, Rob Goldstone on the Trump side, and then you have 4 Russians on the other side. What do you make of that? And what evidence is there coming out of that meeting that there might be a violation of federal criminal law?
So I think that the evidence is actually there in the emails and the fact that they take the meeting, that you could make an argument that it actually crosses the line of federal campaign finance law prohibitions. A prosecutor exercising his or her discretion might not pursue that case.
Let's just look at what the law says, because we're now in an era where judges are textualists and they like to look at the letter of the law rather than what was possibly intended by Congress. It says that in connection with a federal election, anyone who solicits a foreign national to give something of value commits a crime. It doesn't have to be a foreign government, but it reads on solicitation. It reads on a foreign national, and it reads on the most mysterious language, which is broad, something of value. Now, is dirt about Hillary Clinton something of value?
So I think dirt about Hillary Clinton is something of value, and one way of just easily conceiving of that is that there are companies inside Washington, D.C. who make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on the basis of their research to get derogatory information about people's political opponents. So it's something.
But that's compiled information.
That's right.
It wouldn't be just a tip.
What Don Jr. was being told was, in fact, that he would be met by a Russian. Now, it is also the case that he is being told he'd be met by a Russian government lawyer, and that it was the Russian government trying to assist his father.
It was the prosecutor in Russia who had developed the information that he was going to be transmitted.
That's correct. But as you said, we don't even need the connection to the government. Just the fact that he was told you had a foreign national who was going to give him this particular thing of value, and he said, I love it, especially if we use it later in the summer, let's meet. And then it looks like they also had phone calls to set it up. That, I think, alone would trigger the letter of the law with respect to soliciting something of value from a foreign national for the contribution to your campaign. That's how it's all kind of conceived, so we already have that. I'm not sure if a prosecutor would go forward just on that basis, but that's just what we know in terms of in the public space.
But also the statute reads on solicitation, and Donald Jr. went on Hannity, and he admitted that he pressed the Russian lawyer, the woman, Natalia, for information. He pressed her. Now,
Yes.
if that isn't solicitation, I don't know what is.
Yes, he did. I noticed that when he said it in the interview.
Yeah.
It's a major concession.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Ryan Goodman, our legal expert. What do you expect will come out of Mueller's investigation?
Yeah, I expect indictments. I expect indictments.
Of whom?
I expect indictments of Paul Manafort for financial misdeeds with Ukrainian money and things like that, potentially other things related to his financial dealings abroad. I expect there's a high likelihood of indictments for false statements, and if they don't indict them, then they'd be using them for bigger crimes with bigger people. The big open question is what we can expect with respect to some form of collusion. That's just a difficult one. There might even be the evidence there, but there's the question of, does Mueller think he can get over the threshold of sufficient evidence to prove to a jury? And that's going to be the hardest part of it, that nobody can yet tell. But it certainly seems like there is a lot there already that we know about, so let alone what Mueller and his team have at their disposal, might just be we might only know the tip of the iceberg.
So Mike Flynn, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., you think they'll be indicted?
Difficult to know. I think Mike Flynn might very well be indicted at the very least for a false statement to the FBI. Jared Kushner is in deep trouble as well, false statements as well, in his security forms that he submitted that conspicuously omitted these major meetings with, as far as he knew at the time, or should have known at the time, Russian government lawyers and representatives. So there's a lot there. So I do think that we might be entering a period in the near term of something of a crisis in our country.
Crisis in our country and a rain of indictments. Ryan Goodman, this has been just wonderful. I'm sorry we've run out of time. There's so much more I wanted to ask you, but thank you for coming by.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.